Göbekli Tepe is officially dated to 9600 BCE, a stone temple raised by hunter-gatherers thousands of years before writing, before pottery, before Sumer ever existed. For decades it stood alone in the textbooks, one impossible leap from nothing. But Göbekli Tepe was not alone. 40 kilometers away, archaeologists uncovered a second site. The same T-shaped pillars, the same animal carvings, the same silence where a builder's name should be. It is called Karahan Tepe, part of an official excavation network named Tash Tepeler, found in 1997 and barely studied until 2019. One miracle is a mystery, two is a signature. Karahan Tepe was never lost, it was simply ignored. Researchers first identified the site in 1997 during a regional survey across the Şanlıurfa province of southeastern Turkey, the same province that had already produced Göbekli Tepe a few years earlier. For more than 2 decades it sat on official maps, catalogued, named and almost entirely unexamined, while the world's attention poured into a single hill 40 kilometers away. Then, starting in 2019, a new excavation campaign returned to Karahan Tepe with the tools, the funding and the urgency that the first discovery never received. What they found did not look like a footnote. It looked like a twin. The official project overseeing this work carries a name that rarely makes it into the documentaries: Taş Tepeler, Turkish for stone hills. It is not a single dig run by a single ambitious archaeologist chasing one impossible building. It is a coordinated, government-backed research initiative covering an entire cluster of pre-pottery Neolithic sites across the Şanlıurfa Neolithic Research Project, with Karahan Tepe listed as one node among several. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Göbekli Tepe has spent 30 years being framed as a singular anomaly. One site, one moment, one inexplicable leap by people who supposedly had no business building anything monumental at all. Taş Tepeler quietly erases that framing. It does not describe one temple, it describes a landscape. Consider what that landscape actually contains. Archaeologists working under the Taş Tepeler umbrella have now identified roughly a dozen related sites scattered across the same limestone plateau, each excavated to a different depth, each funded on a different timeline, each known to specialists for years before reaching wider attention. Karahan Tepe simply happens to be the one large enough and strange enough to force a reconsideration of what Göbekli Tepe actually was. Not a miracle, a sample. The timing of its rediscovery deserves its own attention. 22 years passed between the survey that first logged Karahan Tepe and the excavation season that finally opened it up. 22 years in which a site carrying the same architectural ambition as Göbekli Tepe sat recorded, mapped and effectively shelved. No looting scandal forced the delay. No funding collapse explains it cleanly. The simplest explanation is also the least satisfying one. There was already too much to study 40 kilometers away, and a second site asking the same uncomfortable questions could wait. It waited. Then, in 2019, it stopped waiting. What changed in 2019 was not the ground. It was the willingness to look at it properly. Renewed excavation seasons, backed by Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, began clearing structures that had been only partially exposed for over a decade. Survey data that had sat in reports since the late 1990s suddenly had context. A site that had been a single line in a regional inventory became, within a few seasons, one of the most actively discussed locations in pre-pottery Neolithic archaeology. The hill had not moved. The attention finally caught up to it. Here is the question this raises, and it is worth sitting with before going any further. If Göbekli Tepe was truly one of a kind, why was there already a second candidate sitting in the official record a year after the first one made headlines? An anomaly does not need a waiting list. A pattern does. This is where the standard account starts to feel incomplete. For years, popular retellings treated Göbekli Tepe as a lightning strike, a single, isolated burst of architectural sophistication that hunter-gatherers were not supposed to be capable of, appearing out of nowhere and vanishing just as suddenly when the site was deliberately buried around 8200 BCE. That version of the story only works if Göbekli Tepe stands alone. Karahan Tepe, sitting in the same provincial survey record since 1997, was never going to let it stand alone forever. The Şanlıurfa Neolithic Research Project did not set out to manufacture a mystery. Its stated purpose is methodical: survey, identify and excavate pre-pottery Neolithic settlements across a defined region before development, agriculture or erosion destroys what remains. That is bureaucratic, unglamorous work. But bureaucratic, unglamorous work is precisely what produced the discovery that quietly dismantles the lightning strike narrative. Karahan Tepe was not found by someone chasing a legend. It was found by a survey team filling in a map. The implications came later, and they came from the data itself, not from anyone's intention to find them. So the real shift is not architectural yet. That comparison comes next. The real shift, first, is structural. Göbekli Tepe was never operating in isolation. It existed inside a research framework that had already logged its closest relative before either site had finished giving up its secrets. One hill treated for decades as the entire story. A second hill, sitting in the same file since 1997, finally excavated starting in 2019, now forcing every account of the first one to be rewritten. The question is no longer whether Göbekli Tepe was extraordinary. It clearly was. The question is whether extraordinary was ever the right word for something that had company all along. There is a useful contrast hiding in the paperwork. Göbekli Tepe was first noted by a survey team in 1963, then effectively forgotten for 30 years until the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revisited the site in 1994 and began full excavations in 1995. That gap, decades between first notice and serious investigation, is not unusual in this field. It is, in fact, almost exactly what happened to Karahan Tepe a generation later. Noted in 1997, shelved, then finally opened up starting in 2019. The same region produced the same pattern twice, on two different hills, separated by roughly 20 years. If one long delay before excavation sounds like an accident, two long delays following the same rhythm start to look like something closer to a procedure. None of this requires concealment. Survey teams across Şanlıurfa logged dozens of mounds long before funding existed to dig even a fraction of them. Karahan Tepe was one name on a long list until its scale made waiting impossible. That is the unglamorous truth behind most discoveries here. Not a cover-up, but a decades-long backlog of sites still waiting their turn. What Taş Tepeler ultimately offers is a shift in scale. Göbekli Tepe, alone, asks how hunter-gatherers built it. Karahan Tepe beside it asks a harder question. How many of these exist? And why does the record already suggest the answer is more than two? That question is where the next part of this story has to begin. Set the two ancient sites carefully side by side, and the comparison stops feeling like comparison. It starts feeling like inventory. Both Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe are built around massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some exceeding 5 meters in height, arranged in circular or oval enclosures sunk into bedrock. Both feature pillars carved with animal reliefs: foxes, boars, snakes, vultures, scorpions, rendered with a level of stylistic confidence that implies practiced tradition, not first attempts. Both sites show no evidence of domestic occupation at their core. No hearths arranged for daily cooking, no household refuse piling up the way it does at an ordinary settlement. Both appear to function as communal or ritual spaces, built by people who, according to the official chronology, had not yet domesticated plants or animals. Two sites, same architecture, same iconography, same absence of ordinary village life. That is not coincidence. That is a signature, and signatures repeat. Scale only sharpens the comparison. Göbekli Tepe's largest enclosure, designated Enclosure D, contains pillars reaching roughly 5.5 meters and weighing an estimated 10 tons each, arranged around a circular space with two larger central pillars facing one another like figures in conversation. Karahan Tepe's central structure, sometimes called the Pillar Hall, follows a strikingly similar logic. Pillars set into bedrock benches, arranged with clear deliberateness rather than scattered placement oriented around a focal point rather than spread at random. Neither layout reads as accidental. Both read as blueprints, not identical buildings, but variations executed from a shared design vocabulary, the way two churches a generation apart might differ in detail while still being unmistakably built from the same architectural grammar. The animal imagery deepens that impression rather than complicating it. At Göbekli Tepe, the carved reliefs lean toward foxes, boars, and snakes, with vultures appearing in contexts researchers have linked to mortuary symbolism. At Karahan Tepe, the iconography shifts slightly in emphasis but not in style. Serpentine forms remain prominent, and at least one structure features a row of carved human heads emerging from a bench, faces turned inward toward the chamber's centre, an arrangement found nowhere else in the region at this date. Different motifs, same underlying confidence. These were not improvised decorations. They were a visual language applied by people who already knew before the first stone was set roughly what the finished space was supposed to communicate. The German Archaeological Institute, which has worked extensively across the Tash Tepeler sites, has been explicit about what this pattern actually represents. Its researchers describe Tash Tepeler as evidence of complex meeting and communal spaces that existed before agriculture and before animal husbandry. Not after, not alongside, but before. That single detail dismantles the old assumption that monumental architecture has to follow farming, that you need surplus grain and settled villages before you can organise people to quarry, carve, and raise multi-ton pillars. The Institute's own framing is blunt. Göbekli Tepe was not only a sanctuary standing apart from its world, it was one expression of a wider Neolithic landscape, one that organised large-scale communal construction before the most basic agricultural tools even existed. Sit with the order of operations there. Civilization, as it is normally taught, runs in a fixed sequence. Farming first, surplus second, villages third, and only then, with food secured and population concentrated, monumental architecture. Tash Tepeler runs that sequence backward. The pillars came first. The hierarchy implied by their construction came first. The organising knowledge required to plan, transport, and erect them came first. Agriculture, by comparison, arrived almost as an afterthought, something that happened after these communities had already proven they could build at a scale most settled societies would not attempt for millennia. And yet, for all that organisational sophistication, neither site has produced a single name. No founder, no architect, no priest, chief, or lineage credited with the work. There is no inscription because there is no writing. Writing would not exist in this region for another 6,000 years. There is no oral tradition recorded at the time, because there was no one yet to record it in any form that survives. What remains is the structure itself, precise, repeated, deliberate, and utterly silent about who built it. This is the part that deserves to sit uncomfortably rather than be resolved too quickly. A society capable of organising the labour to quarry stone, carve it with consistent iconography across multiple sites, and raise it into standing enclosures is not a loose band operating on instinct. That kind of coordination implies planning, implies authority structures, implies someone who decided where the next pillar would stand and who would carve it. Somebody gave the instructions. Nobody's name survived giving them. That absence is no longer a gap in the documentation. By this point, it clearly reads as the single most consistent feature of the entire record. Ask who organised the labour at Göbekli Tepe and the honest answer is unknown. Ask the same of Karahan Tepe and the answer does not change. Ask whether either community left behind a founding figure, a remembered leader, even a symbolic title carved anywhere into the stone, and the answer, again, is no. 3 questions, 2 sites, 1 answer repeating itself with no variation at all. Compare that absence to almost every later civilization that built anything comparable. Egypt names its pharaohs on the monuments they raised. Mesopotamia names its kings in foundation inscriptions. Even small Bronze Age temples often carry a dedicatory line crediting a ruler or a patron. Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe carry nothing of the kind, not because the builders lacked the capacity for organisation, but because they existed before the kind of record-keeping that preserves names had been invented anywhere on Earth. The architecture survived. The architects did not. That asymmetry is the real subject of this comparison, more than the pillars themselves. 2 sites, 40 kilometres apart, sharing the same construction signature, the same iconographic vocabulary, the same communal function, and the same total silence about who was responsible. If this were one site, it would be a curiosity. As 2 sites, examined side by side under one official research framework, it stops being a curiosity and becomes something closer to a pattern with no attached identity. A known architectural style with no known author, repeating across a landscape, exactly as the German Archaeological Institute's own framing suggests it should. The natural next question is whether that pattern stays confined to 2 hills, or whether the absence of names is itself part of something larger still unfolding. 2 sites were never the real number. They were just the 2 that happened to get funded first. Beyond Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, the Taş Tepeler project lists roughly a dozen related mounds scattered across the same limestone plateau in Şanlıurfa province: Sayburç, Nevalıçori, Çakmaktepe, Sefertepe, and several others, each showing fragments of the same architectural grammar: T-shaped pillars, sunken communal enclosures, animal-carved benches, no domestic clutter at the core. Most remain only partially excavated, some barely touched beyond an initial survey trench, but the pattern holding across the ones that have been opened is consistent enough that researchers no longer treat any single mound as the origin point. There is no first site in this network, no founding location from which the others supposedly spread. There is only a region that, for reasons still unexplained, produced the same architectural idea in multiple places at roughly the same time. That detail matters more than it first appears. A single extraordinary building can be explained as one community's unusual achievement, a local genius, a lucky convergence of resources and ambition. A dozen related sites sharing the same construction logic across one province cannot be explained the same way. Either the idea spread between communities fast enough to leave an identical signature everywhere it landed, or every community independently arrived at the same architectural solution within the same few centuries. Both explanations require something: trade, travel, shared ritual specialists, travelling knowledge keepers of some kind that connected these communities far more tightly than the standard hunter-gatherer picture usually allows. And once again, none of it comes with a name. Not one site in the entire Taş Tepeler network has produced a king list, a founder's title, or even a single recorded word. The silence noted at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe individually turns out to be the rule for the whole region, not the exception at 2 unlucky sites. A dozen mounds, 1 architectural language, 0 names. This is the point where reaching for Mesopotamia becomes hardest to resist, and where caution matters most. To be direct about it, no cuneiform tablet names the builders of Karahan Tepe. No Sumerian inscription identifies anyone who raised a T-shaped pillar in Şanlıurfa. There is no archaeological link, no excavated object, no translated text that connects these pre-pottery Neolithic stone enclosures to any specific Mesopotamian record. That connection does not exist, and claiming otherwise would misrepresent what has actually been found. What does exist, several thousand years later, and roughly 400 kilometers to the southeast, is a different kind of record entirely. Sumerian and Babylonian texts describing a world before a great flood, populated by figures the Sumerians called sages. 7 of them, in the most common telling, sent or arriving to teach humanity the foundations of civilization before the waters came and erased what had existed previously. The Sumerian king list itself preserves a list of rulers said to have reigned before the flood, with lifespans stretched into the thousands of years, followed by the blunt note that the flood swept over the land, and kingship began again afterward, as if everything before that point belonged to a different category of memory entirely. No version of this material claims to describe Göbekli Tepe or Karahan Tepe specifically. That has to be stated plainly. What it describes is a cultural memory, recorded millennia after the pre-pottery Neolithic sites were deliberately buried, of a prior world with its own builders, its own bearers of knowledge, and its own catastrophic ending. A memory that survived only as names and titles, attached to no verifiable location, arriving in writing only after the people it might have originally described were already long gone. The gap between those two things is the part worth sitting with. The stone builders of Şanlıurfa left architecture but no names. The Sumerian tradition, arriving thousands of years later, preserved names: sage, king, teacher, but no architecture, no coordinates, no physical site anyone has ever excavated to match them against. One tradition has buildings without builders, the other has builders without buildings. Whether those two absences are pointing at the same thing, or are simply 2 unrelated cultures separately inventing the idea of forgotten ancestors, is not something this evidence can settle. What can be said, carefully, is this: civilizations do not typically lose the names of the people who organize their most ambitious projects unless something interrupts the chain of memory that would normally carry those names forward. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried around 8,200 BCE. Karahan Tepe shows similar signs of intentional backfilling. Whatever happened at these sites did not fade naturally. It was closed, on purpose, by the people who had built it. And somewhere in the silence that followed, a region that organised monumental construction before agriculture even existed managed to leave behind every detail, except the one detail every later civilization considered worth recording first: who was responsible. The Hellenistic-era Babylonian writer Berossus preserved a version of this tradition. A being called Owans, first among 7 sages, said to have taught early humanity writing, mathematics, agriculture and city building before vanishing again. The Sumerians called this category of figure the Apkallu, advisors and transmitters of divine instruction, never rulers in their own right. What stands out is not the mythology itself, shared in some form across many ancient cultures, but its specific shape. Knowledge did not originate with the people then living. It arrived from somewhere earlier, carried by figures remembered only by title and function, never by ordinary biography. That detail is the closest thing to a thread connecting the silence at Şanlıurfa to the noise in Mesopotamia thousands of years later. The stone builders left no record explaining where their knowledge of monumental construction came from either. No apprenticeship, no founding teacher, no origin story carved into the pillars themselves. The know-how simply appears, fully formed, in the archaeological record, the same way the Apkallu appear, fully formed, in the textual record millennia afterward. 2 unrelated traditions, thousands of years apart, both describing organised knowledge with no traceable origin and no individual credited with inventing it. That parallel proves nothing and should not be mistaken for proof. It is a pattern of absence echoing across an enormous span of time. Nothing more concrete than that, but absences this specific, repeating this consistently, are rarely the kind of detail worth dismissing outright either. The network has a shape now. What it does not have, anywhere in it, is a name to put at the centre. Picture one person standing at the centre of this. Not a king, because there were no kings yet. Not a priest in any sense we would recognise, because there was no temple tradition to ordain one into. Just someone, a planner, an organiser, the person other people in that community looked to when it came time to decide where the next pillar would stand and how deep the next enclosure would be sunk into the bedrock. That person existed. The architecture proves it, the same way a building always proves there was someone who decided its shape before the first stone moved. They would have walked the quarry site, watched the carvers work the limestone into foxes and boars and serpents, given the instruction to set this pillar facing that one, like 2 figures left in permanent conversation, and that person's name is gone, as completely as if it had never been spoken at all. Now picture that signature repeating. Not once, at one hill, but at a second hill 40 kilometres away, raised by people who may never have met the first community, may never have shared a language with them, and yet somehow arrived at the same pillars, the same enclosures, the same animal carvings, the same silence about who was responsible. Then picture it a third time, and a fourth, scattered across a dozen mounds throughout the same limestone plateau, each one a slightly different verse of the same architectural song. Whoever organised that knowledge, and however it spread from community to community, it moved without ever once attaching itself to a person history could hold on to. Whatever passed between these communities, kinship, trade routes, shared ritual specialists walking from one settlement to the next, it carried the blueprint and somehow dropped every name along the way. There may have been dozens of people like the one standing at the centre of Karahan Tepe, organisers, carvers, the quiet authority behind each enclosure, scattered across this plateau over centuries, each contributing one more variation to the same architectural language, each as unrecorded as the last. None of them knew they were part of a network. None of them could have known that, thousands of years later, someone would lay their separate hills side by side and recognise the same hand at work in all of them. They built for their own community, for whatever ritual or belief organised their world, never imagining that the only thing to survive would be the shape of the stone itself, stripped of every name that once stood behind it. What were they protecting, if anything? Why does competence this advanced, competence sophisticated enough to plan multi-ton stone construction before farming existed anywhere in the region, leave behind every trace except the one trace every later civilization considered essential to preserve? Who decided that the pillars mattered enough to carve and the names did not? Was the silence deliberate, the way the burial of Göbekli Tepe itself was deliberate, or simply what happens to memory once enough centuries pass without writing to hold it in place? 4 questions. No answer attached to any of them. Only the stone, still standing, still asking on their behalf, long after everyone who could have answered is gone. No one left to answer. Only the ancient architecture, patient, indifferent, still holding the shape of a question no one wrote down. Here is the full shape of what has actually been established, laid out in order, start to finish. Göbekli Tepe, officially dated to 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, monumental T-shaped pillars raised by pre-pottery Neolithic hunter-gatherers, first logged by a survey in 1963, properly excavated only after 1995, deliberately buried by its own builders around 8,200 BCE, and treated for decades afterward as a singular, unrepeatable miracle standing alone in the textbooks. Karahan Tepe, discovered in 1997 during the same regional survey work, left largely unexamined for 22 years, then reopened in 2019 to reveal the same pillars, the same iconography, the same total absence of any builder's name. Proof, finally, that the miracle had company all along and had been sitting in the official record the entire time. The Tash Tepeler project. A dozen related mounds across Wangenlöfer Plateau, no founding site privileged among them, no first inventor anywhere in the chain, just a regional architectural language with no attached author wherever it appears. The German Archaeological Institute's own framing. Complex communal space organised before agriculture, before animal husbandry, before the tidy sequence every textbook insists has to come first. And, thousands of years later, in a different language, on a different kind of record entirely, a Sumerian memory of sages who arrived from somewhere earlier to teach civilization's foundations, remembered only by title, never by ordinary biography, attached to no excavated coordinates anywhere on Earth. None of those pieces taken alone proves anything beyond exactly what it is. Put them in order though, end to end, and a different picture starts to form. Not a single mystery sitting on one Turkish hill, but a wider, older builder culture whose name never survived its own silence, leaving behind only the architecture itself, and perhaps an echo of itself recorded centuries after the fact by people who may have been remembering something real without ever fully knowing what they were remembering. That is the real correction this comparison forces. For 30 years, Göbekli Tepe was treated as the mystery, the one impossible site standing alone, demanding its own explanation, as if explaining one hill could ever be enough. It was never that, and it was never going to stay that. Karahan Tepe was always there, filed and waiting since 1997, ready to dissolve that framing the moment anyone returned to dig. A dozen more mounds are still waiting beside it, recorded, mapped, and barely touched. The same way Karahan Tepe once waited. Each one is a question mark sitting in a survey report, gathering dust until funding and attention finally arrive together, the way they arrived at Karahan Tepe in 2019, 22 years later than they should have. Göbekli Tepe was not the mystery. It was the first visible piece of a whole lost builder world, a world with no recorded founder, no recorded language, and no recorded name, but with a signature precise enough to recognise across a dozen hills and thousands of years. The rest of that world is still out there, mostly unexcavated, mostly unnamed, waiting the same patient way Karahan Tepe waited for 22 years, for someone to finally come back and look again.